Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this IOSH Swiss Network webinar on crisis communication. And we're delighted to have Mick Ord here to talk to us today. So IOSH have been looking at different ways that they can communicate with their members, and they're running two things at the moment. I'd like to draw your attention to the difference. So we've had a few Zoom meetings. A Zoom meeting is an invitation-only, quite a small event where there's quite a lot of opportunity for discussion. So please come with your questions. And I really recommend that if you get an invitation that you join us for one of those. And then the second thing that we're having is the webinars, slightly different. They'll look the same running online, but a much larger group of people and taking Q&A at the end, a lot less interactive. So we're offering both those formats. So welcome to Mick Ord. Mick is a crisis communications expert. He has a background working with the BBC. At the moment, the media is only talking about one thing, coronavirus, and we can all probably name companies that have had big problems in this area. I'm thinking particularly of the meat processing companies in Germany and in America that have been all over the news. So what this presentation is about today is to try and help companies, if they're in the spotlight, make sure that they know how to react. Usually Mick runs this as a highly interactive face-to-face session, but today he's going to try and run it over a webinar. So good luck with that, Mick, and I hope it goes really, really well. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks very much, Alison. I'd just like to tell you a little bit about my organisation and what I do. I started off as a BBC reporter back in '85. And I was covering stories such as the Heysel Stadium disaster, a bit later the Hillsborough disaster. It was a difficult time in the 80s, I think, on Merseyside. Often we were doing local, national and international stories. Anyway, I eventually became longest serving manager of Radio Merseyside, leaving in 2012. Worked throughout the BBC through a career lasting just under 30 years. I joined BBC Learning as head of religion website in 2012, and then I took VR 5 years ago to set up my consultancy. So first thought, and there'll be quite a few thoughts today, quoting from people from all over the world, not just Britain. I've tried to be as geographically correct as possible, but I love this one from Tom Landry, who was the Dallas Cowboys coach. I don't believe in team motivation. That's surprising for a football coach. I believe in getting a team prepared so it knows it will have the necessary confidence when it steps onto a field and be prepared to play a good game. Today, we'll be talking about the media, obviously, the preparation for your crisis comms, the golden hour. Is it still applicable? I still call it the golden hour. That's the first section, small section of time when you know you've got a crisis on your hand. Internal comms, the importance of internal comms, the rule of three, understanding audiences, calls to action, really, really important at the end of your interview, and maybe at the beginning and the middle as well, depending on what is the call to action. A lot of people forget that. Good and bad examples from TV and radio we'll have a look at. The importance of being proactive, and the nightmare questions. If you're in a crisis or you're near a crisis or you're in a situation that you think you might eventually lead to media spotlight, you need to sort out beforehand your nightmare questions. I'm going to repeat myself a lot today, but I'm not going to apologize for it because I think it's really important. I will be saying the same thing, running through this like a stick of rock for a while. Please bear with me because I do think it's important. The word crisis, as some of you probably know, comes from the Greek word crisis. Excuse my pronunciation, it probably is not pronounced like that in Greek, meaning the turning point in a disease. And at such a moment, the person with the disease could get better or worse. It's a critical moment. And of course, the appropriateness of that definition will not be lost on us today. The corporate definition is perhaps a bit closer to an event or a series of events which affects your organization's reputation, brand, and revenue. Sometimes in that order, not necessarily in that order. So what do most journalists want? Well, believe it or not, they want your story, whatever that is, explained in a clear and concise way. Yes, they want facts and figures and photos, but not too many, certainly initially. They do want sound bites, but that should not affect adversely the way you say and how you say it. Authenticity and not spin. People can suss spin at a mile's distance. Leave the spin to the politicians. Don't try to copy them. I'm going to say that a number of times today as well. And honesty. Don't pretend you're knowledgeable about a particular topic if you're not. So what is news? Well, Charles Anderson Dana from the 19th century said, when a dog bites a man, that is not news. When a man bites a dog, that is news. Lord Northcliffe, who was the very famous newspaper proprietor in Britain in the first sort of 20, 30 years of the 20th century, said, news is what somebody somewhere wants to suppress. All the rest is advertising. And I think today, journalists still hold on to that mantra. Someone is trying to hide something. The philosophy of the news media. Henry B. Eyring is well into his 90s now. He may be even 100, and he's the head of the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And I found this quotation from him a couple of months ago. We live in a world where finding fault in others seems to be the favorite blood sport. It has long been the basis of political campaign strategy. It's the theme of much TV programming across the world, as I'm sure we all recognize here today. It sells newspapers. Whenever we meet anyone, our first almost unconscious reaction may be to look for imperfection. And journalists do that to a greater or lesser degree. But from a journalist's point of view, why is this lying bastard lying to me? Louis Heron was the Times foreign correspondent in the 30s, and he was a famous quote that's been repeated many times since then. I'm going to play you now a clip that most BBC presenters and reporters, when they're training to work for the BBC, will see. It's about 7 or 8 minutes, which is longer than any of the other clips we're going to play today, you'd be delighted to know. The guy on the left is Peter Allen, and he no longer works on a daily basis for 5 Live. He still appears on their airways. 5 Live, for those of you who don't know, is a news and sport all-talk radio station in the UK. The woman to his right is Jane Harvey, and they used to present a news programme together. And here Peter and Jane a little bit explains tips for journalists when they're just about to embark on a career. And this is to give you an idea, a little bit more idea, behind Louis Heron's statement that we've just seen. So I'll click this and you just have a listen to this. This gives you a fairly good idea of what certainly most broadcast journalists are trained to be like.
Live news, live sport.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Good afternoon, 4 o'clock. Welcome to Drive with Jane Garvey and Peter Allen. Our main story, the Home Secretary warns of the danger of an electronic attack by terrorists.
Also in the news, 4 men have appeared at a court in London and admitted planning terrorist attacks.
Let's talk then about the kind of interviews you might meet during the programme, and everyone who gets in this business will meet. And I guess the first one you have to talk about is the political interview. And by that, I don't mean necessarily just a politician. It is somebody who is schooled in producing a particular line of argument. Politicians are the prime example. Trade union leaders, business leaders, might be a policeman. Anyone who's sat there and come out to meet you, but before coming out to meet you has had a chat and said, look, this is the line I'm going to take. The main story, the calls for an inquiry into how anti-terrorist operations are being compromised by leaks to the media.
Well, the accusation was raised, as we reported last night on Drive, by the man in charge of counter-terrorism at Scotland Yard, Peter Clark. He's not known for shooting his mouth off, and he didn't mince his words. He said disclosures to the media had damaged the investigation into an alleged plot in Birmingham, and he accused people of leaking sensitive intelligence, thereby putting lives at risk.
Let's talk to David Davis, the Shadow Home Affairs spokesman. Good evening.
Good evening.
So what do you want from Sir Gus O'Donnell, who is the Cabinet Secretary?
We want an inquiry. I mean, at the time this issue came up, when the first arrests were made, I spoke to the Chief Constable of the West Midlands because I was concerned at what had gone on.
My feeling is this, you give a politician or any sort of spokesman one answer to put their case effectively you ask them something, they probably answer something rather different. But you give them that first minute, that at least they should have the opportunity to say, here is my case. But after that, you try to force them onto the question you've asked. You mustn't allow them to slide away, because they will simply answer a series of 4 questions with a series of 4 answers which have got nothing to do with it. And so you must be prepared to interrupt. Perhaps you should be talking about the police investigating then, rather than Sir why have you gone to Sir Gus O'Donnell, unless indeed your aim is actually just to make it sound as if you believe the government did it, because you've got no evidence that the government did this.
Because he is the head of the Home Civil Service and responsible right across the Home Civil Service, including...
But you don't know that it did come from the Home Office.
With respect, let me answer your question before you come back with an allegation. The simple truth is that it might be the right way to do it with a police force.
It's like a tournament, it's like a jousting match. If you can somehow do it in a way which ensures that people listening still find it engaging, that is the other ingredient. Not easy. Listen out, you'll hear lots of people trying and lots of people not doing very well. But it is the most difficult interview to do, and probably the most important as well.
So discussing the top stories, there aren't a huge number of things around this morning. Alan Ball is obviously, the death of Alan Ball last night is obviously one of the big things we should continue, maybe second lead at this stage. Steve's...
So every morning we get together in this small room, and about 7 or 8 of those producers and DJs who will put the programme together, get together, and they're all required to come along with some ideas. Not necessarily ideas on the main news agenda, just ideas which will provide items later in the day.
The other 2 things that grabbed me very quickly, the smoking story, which June was having a quick look at, but they've done a lot on breakfast already, and it's basically NICE, the clinical excellence body, suggesting that employers should kind of give people time off work.
But I mean, what's it going to do with NICE? What I'm really looking for in this part of the day, if I turn up to the morning meeting, is just ideas which will spark that conversation, which is the essential ingredient of the programme. It's something which makes me sit up, really.
It's going to get people going. Because people get annoyed, don't they, that people nip out for a fag, and if you add up how many minutes, if I added up, he's had 20 minutes off today and I haven't even had a lunch break. It just gets people riled.
Well, we've got a good issue here, haven't we? Which got us all going, I reckon. OK, that's going to be a bit more prominent than maybe it was.
I'm just going to do an interview with Lucy Blackman's mother, a lady called Jane. And Lucy, of course, is the lady who died in Japan, was murdered. And her mother is obviously a bereaved person. I think really the interview, though, is about a mother and a daughter, to be honest. It's the kind of thing which anybody listening will feel an immediate sense of association with. This is basically somebody's daughter. And so when I say you have to get inside the mind of the person you're interviewing, you have to think to yourself, how would she feel? How would I feel if it were my daughter? And the answer is you'd feel stricken. And I guess that's what the interview will display. I haven't really thought of what the questions will be, to be honest, and they will probably just occur. I mean, you know what you're trying to get. There will be areas which will be mapped out, and the researcher would tend to give me a piece of paper like this, which would have various suggested questions and various bits of background. But I find that once the interview begins, it should flow. It should essentially be a conversation. It should be just the 2 of us. I mean, it's what, 7 years now, isn't it?
It's nearly 7 years that she went to Japan, yes.
And it's impossible, I guess, to let go because you don't feel that the case has been closed?
I don't know how you ever let go of losing your daughter in the most tragic circumstances. It's just something you learn to live with.
Do you learn to live with it, really? I mean, I guess I'm just trying to imagine how it is to be you, and I guess you wake up every morning and the first thought in your mind is
yeah, I mean, I don't really sleep, and you do think about her. I do think about her all the time, really. I mean, if I hear some music or I see somebody, from the back that looks like Lucy, sometimes if I do sleep, I do have this dream where I have this awful dream where she's hugging me and she's alive, and I go, Lucy, I just can't believe I had the most terrible dream. I thought you were killed in Japan. And she said, no, Mummy, I'm here, I'm safe, and she's hugging me. And then I wake up and I realise it was just a dream, and that is really hard.
And there were some tremendously affecting moments of the interview. I mean, talking about the dream she has every night of her daughter being back with her and then waking to the reality and sudden thought of how the daughter died. And that was one of those moments when I said you have to try and imagine how it would be to be the parent. I hadn't quite thought of that, but that of course is a shocking thought, isn't it, of thinking every night, how did that girl die, and remembering how her life ended, just wondering, was she conscious, did she suffer, did she cry out, what happened, never knowing, and always waking up and wondering. And I think probably that was a very effective part of the interview, and the job was done. I remember the first job I covered where there'd been a bereavement as a reporter was a young boy who'd been burnt to death in a shed, and his parents were outside and couldn't get into him, and I turned up as a 19-year-old and thought, oh, how awful. And so I didn't talk to the parents, and I got a picture from the neighbour, and the father came knocking on the office door of the newspaper the next day and said, how dare you? How dare you talk about my son and not talk to me? And how dare you use that rubbish picture? We've got a lovely picture of him. And I never forgot the experience. You know, go in there. They're not, people do want to, you know, you certainly must ask them. Obviously, you must show some diffidence and be prepared to go away if they tell you to go away. But most don't. Most won't tell you. Most do want to get their story over. And then how do you deal with them? Well, try and put yourself in their position.
5. Smoking. Is this your favourite story of the day about Nice?
A lot of the interviews will be information interviews, effectively. You're simply trying to make sure that you get all the information available. I mean, it's the old journalist stuff of who, when, where, why, what, how. Just think of all the questions that you can along those lines. And as I've said with every other interview, do listen, because people will give you clues that they've, you know, sometimes got something to say, and you do sometimes hear, you know, interviews go through and the interviewer's missed it. You know, they haven't really listened. The person at the other end does really have something to say.
This is 5 Live.
With Peter Allen and Jane Garvey.
5 Live Drive.
3 hours with Peter Allen. God. Here he is. Are you going to pay for tea?
That is the big question. So here endeth the lesson. I mean, and there's only one thing I'd really want to say about all these techniques. Remember, we're in conversation. It's as simple as that. Radio is a conversation. And as an interviewer, you have to engage in conversation, and you have to make sure that the listener also is able to engage in that conversation.
Ooh, or something. Would that be the headline?
The weather?
Chillier than lately tonight.
That's what we're doing. We're getting people involved in that conversation, and everything you do, all those interviews I've described, you must always remember that it's just a conversation. It's very simple.
So the summary from Peter Allen. It is a conversation. The presenter uses prepared questions as guidance, but he will be able to move beyond that. It's not cast iron rules. If you're a player at the heart of the crisis, you'll get one chance at most to put your case, and then it's a free-for-all. Now, that's true of politicians. That's probably true of major mover and shakers, Richard Branson or whatever, big players in the business industry. But if you're working for a company that's not been in the spotlight before, they will be probably far more lax about that. They will give you more than one chance, depending on the nature of the crisis that you're involved in. So that won't be the case 99% of the time. You'll get more than one. But remember, from the journalist's point of view, we're talking broadcast media here mainly. I include online in that, obviously. It is just a conversation. And so that should be reflected in your tone and your content, because the listener for the broadcaster is the most important person. And you need to remember that. You're talking to the listener, not to Peter Allen or Jane Garvey or anybody else. I think most of you recognize this guy. One of his mantras, one of his lesser known public statements was, let our advanced worrying become advanced thinking and planning. So consistency of messaging on platforms, on all your platforms, is crucial. Getting the tone right for the audience as well. Is it going to be personal or business? Are you being interviewed at a trade show or an all-talk news radio station or a commercial station that mainly plays pop all the time? Is it prime time news? Is it business news? Does your messaging, when you and your senior leadership team are discussing this, or your clients are discussing this, does your messaging affirm who is in charge? What is your call to action? Over communication, particularly in the golden hour, particularly in the initial period of a crisis, is really important. Radio silence is pretty deadly. Are the crisis management plans ready to go? Devolved responsibilities is, of course, essential if you have the team, if you have the numbers of team there, and you will report to a central command and control run by the CEO or whoever's in charge. Are your communications playing a key role in the decisions? If they're not involved in the decisions, they need to know what their decisions are, and ideally what the alternatives to that are. Obviously, as well, in close cooperation with the lawyers present. Make regular time and space as well to check the progress, of the response to the crisis. Do the comms plan have a prominent place in your strategy? The best laid plans, as Churchill implied, are worthless if they can't be communicated. Have they been updated and stress tested recently? Have your spokespeople been media trained, and are their skills up to scratch? And how do you know that? So is all your company information lined up and ready to go? Have you rehearsed how to answer your nightmare questions from the media? All this needs to be a regular conversation. Or are you sitting back and hoping that the horrible weather, the horrible storm will go and the crisis will disappear? So how you react initially in that golden hour when you get a call from the media is really important. They could find out in a number of ways. They were hoping, you might have been hoping that the media wouldn't find out, and they do. A national story may suddenly have big local implications, or international story like coronavirus. Next week's big announcement that you were going to make leaks out too early. Unexpected event in your patch, generally a mishap or a disaster which breaks on social media. News doesn't break on the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news nowadays. It breaks in social media, as you know. So use your prep time well. And do your prep, whoever is interviewing you. And we'll see examples of people that clearly didn't do their prep shortly. Know your subject. You'll know more than the interviewer, that's for sure, or your client. And make 3 key points you want to make to the general viewer. Rehearse them. Don't read from a script either. It sounds awful, particularly awful on radio. Try bullet points if you are on the radio and you do need to crib. Try bullet points instead, or buzzwords. Don't look down and read out whole sentences. Don't worry if you don't like what you sound or look like. Nobody does. Nobody does. Know your audience. Know who the listener and viewer is on the program that you're appearing on. And with a bit of luck, as Seneca said, that's what happens when preparation meets opportunity. What are your key points? What areas is the reporter going to cover? You need to have a discussion about this. Think about compelling verbal images to add power to the detail, if possible. If none come to mind, don't worry about it. And one of my big messages, and I did this when I made sure that our staff did this in the newsroom where I worked. Practice key phrases out beforehand. There's nothing wrong with saying it out loud, even though it's a bit embarrassing in an office with 3 or with 23 people. Saying it out loud. The number of times you hear it on the radio, I used to hear people go out, and because they go on to read the bulletin, but because they hadn't said the words out beforehand that someone else had written, they'd stumble over it, or it wouldn't sound convincing. So I used to get all the news readers to read the copy out beforehand. And I think that's a really good idea. Get over the embarrassment and get your clients or yourself to do that. Being nervous is good. You need to be nervous, I think. Not too nervous, but you do need to have your wits about you. Questions to ask before. Is it live or recorded interview? Have you got time to think and prepare properly? Do you understand what you're being asked about and why? If you're speaking to a reporter over the phone and they said, well, we're going to ask you about one particular area, he probably won't give you the direct question, and I wouldn't expect him to. But you need to understand the general area that they want to talk about. Ask about those areas. In person or in Zoom is better than over the phone for quality purposes. The other thing you need to be aware of is, will anybody else be interviewed on the same subject at either the same time or immediately after you? If they're going to be immediately after you, then you need to, maybe a few red lights need to go on. Are they going to be commenting on what you're saying? Are they likely to be critical? Would you prefer to be in a one-to-one with somebody or not? Do you want to avoid that conflict situation? Stuff to think about. Look in the mirror before you go on air, as I tried to do the day before this, and unfortunately I can't get a hairdresser at the moment, so apologies for the way I look. Ask colleagues or even the producer and reporter if you look okay, if you look good. Don't be afraid of silence on the radio, as I says, it makes you appear thoughtful. If there are too many silences on radio, it makes you appear as if you're shifty. But the odd silence, it makes you seem as if you're thinking about what you're about to talk about. Don't worry about your accent, says he with a Scouse accent. Don't worry about your accent or stumbling. Authenticity is the key, and do not copy politicians. They have a different modus operandi, as I'm sure you know, a different modus operandi to most of us, a different agenda. If you're someone that tends to ramble a lot under pressure, take a few deep breaths before the interview. Don't try to emulate celebrities, as I've said. Just be yourself as far as you can be anyway. And remember, the interviewer wants you to be articulate and convincing. He or she wants the audience engaged. So they're on your side most of the time. We now live in a world of 24-hour news, as you all know. It's seldom too late, but the earlier the better you engage with the media. Much better. The golden hour, the golden period, I'm not actually talking literally 60 minutes. It's crucial to your comms. Get on the story quickly. Many local newspapers print editions as morning newspapers. The earlier they get stories and statements, the better they can display them on the website. Radio's biggest audience is at breakfast, TV in the evening. Radio spikes at lunchtime and drive. No comment is no use to anyone. You look as if you're hiding something and that you're losing control of the conversation. If you're not ready to make a statement, you say, a statement will be made at 2:30 this afternoon. We've launched an investigation. We're doing a press conference at 2 this afternoon. Don't say no comment. And then the stuff I said before about not reading out from a prepared sheet, I'd be really interested to hear what you think of this at the end of our session today. Here's a guy that really breaks all the rules. I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think it works. There was a security alert at Old Trafford, Manchester United's ground about 5 or 6 years ago. And the security guys who were checking, had been a security not an investigation, they were doing a big security check at the ground. And one of the members of the security team had left his bag in one of the dressing rooms or a room at the ground and left the building. They didn't know what it was, and 75,000 people were evacuated from the ground, from Manchester United's ground. The match was postponed, and it was the club lost millions of pounds. And this particular guy took responsibility for that. He was from the security firm involved.
This mistake is entirely mine. I have to take full responsibility for leaving the training item behind on Wednesday. I have been part of the Metropolitan Police Service Specialist Search Unit since 1985 and retired in 2011. I have dedicated my service to defeating terrorism within the specialist areas that I have been privileged to have worked for and the people I have worked beside. I'm absolutely devastated that a lapse in my working protocols has resulted in many people being disappointed, frightened and inconvenienced. Nothing I can say will rectify that. All I can say is that what I do to try and ensure the safety of the public at sporting and other events in an operational role has been my life's work, and I continue to do it. The training that I provide is aimed at the security staff who deal with situations like that which occurred on Sunday, keeping everyone safe week after week. They are the front line and do a fantastic job, as they did with the calm and controlled evacuation procedures on Sunday. There are always lessons to be learned, both by me and the security regimes that will be observing this incident. I hope I can continue to provide the public with my knowledge and experience again in the future.
We could maybe discuss a little bit later whether you think that worked. Sorry about the buffering there, it was out of sync, as you know. But the general audio came over, and the point he made, I'm sure you could hear. Spokespeople, though, should rehearse out loud beforehand, as I said before. It's too important to leave to chance. Remember, in a crisis, every word of a leader or a spokesman counts. People are listening. Keep to the rules, but be prepared to break them if absolutely necessary. Front of house staff, crucial in any crisis. Do they know how to deal with a media inquiry? And some members of the media, you'll be astonished to hear, don't always tell the truth when they're ringing up an organisation like that, like yours. So they need to know, the front of house staff, what is the protocol? Ensure all staff know the media request drill. Social media discipline is, of course, more important now than ever. They need to have clear, simple guidelines. There's a quotation from somebody who you all know. I don't know whether you'll know who actually said this. It wasn't Churchill. Never ask me when you have good news to announce, because with good news, nothing presses. But when you have bad news, arouse me immediately, for then there is not an instant to be lost. Who said that? This fella, Napoleon. Sometimes being in a crisis can feel like being in a war. We know that. Right, this is the ex-BBC Director General, the ex-boss of the BBC, George Entwistle. About 9 years ago, there was the Jimmy Savile inquiry in Britain with a famous TV personality who had worked a long time for the BBC. He died, but stories about his sexual abuse came out after that. Most of you, at least from the UK, will know that. If you don't know about that from other parts of Europe, then it was a terrible scandal. And the BBC Director General, who'd only been in post for a short while, was asked to come into the Today programme on Radio 4 on the Friday to discuss the whole scandal and the fact that a Newsnight programme about Jimmy Savile, the report had been pulled at the last minute. This is while when he was alive. So the BBC did not report on this, or they weren't the first people to report on the story at the time. And he was asked to come into the Today programme on Radio 4 on the Saturday morning. What could possibly go wrong? George Entwistle had been in broadcasting for more than 30 years. He was an experienced editor in the BBC, very, very highly regarded. And he was being interviewed by a guy called John Humphreys, who was known as the BBC's Rottweiler in general at the time. I'll just play this for a couple of minutes, but it shows you that even people who are highly experienced with lots of media training can sometimes fall on their backside during an interview.
Amazing investigations again.
The BBC has, hardly need to tell you this, a unique position in this country. It has unique privileges, and it earns those on the basis of the trust that the people of this country have in the BBC. That's severely damaged, possibly destroyed, hasn't it?
Well, I don't believe it's been destroyed. The BBC has had crises of trust before. This is a bad crisis of trust, I admit it. But what you have to do is show your audiences that their trust in you is ready to restore. And the way you do that is you're open and clear about finding out what's gone wrong. And we've done that. We're doing that through Savile. We have 2 reviews, independent reviews, to find out what went wrong there in both cases and to be able to put those facts in front of the audience and show them the lessons we've learned from it. I'm doing the same thing here. This is a more contained case. I'm acting decisively and quickly this weekend. I hope to have a report on my desk by Sunday, by which point I hope, know exactly what happened, and I'll know what further action to take, including disciplinary action if that's appropriate.
Disciplining other people, but at no point will you say to yourself, I, George Entwistle, should have been much more alert to the dangers in all this. I should have been watching it like a hawk right from the very beginning. Everything Newsnight did in this area, I should have been on top of. Not editing the programme down there on the stone, as it were, but I, Director General, the Editor-in-Chief, should have been on top of everything that programme did. I was remiss in that. It's no good me blaming other people because I am the boss. Do you not see that people will say, he's talking about disciplining other people, he's not saying, I was remiss.
John, you're effectively asking me to become the editor of Newsnight. I was editor.
I'm not. I'm absolutely
yes, you are.
not doing that. It has an editor. He answers to you. You, therefore, should have said to him, what are you up to, old boy?
I was editor of Newsnight. I know what level of attention to detail that takes.
And you answer to your bosses.
That is where that level of scrutiny should take place. And
not with you at all. You are entirely blameless.
And I answer to my bosses. I answer to the Trust. I am a director.
So not unless the Trust says to you, Mr. Entwistle, we're worried about the way you've been running the BBC in this regard, this vitally important regard over the past few weeks, not unless they do that will you consider your own position. Is that right?
Amazing investigations again.
The BBC has, hardly need to tell you this, a unique position in this country. It has unique privileges, and it earns those on the basis of the trust that the people of this country have in the BBC. That trust has been severely damaged, possibly destroyed, hasn't it?
Well, I don't believe it's been destroyed. The BBC has had...
And so on, it goes for another 6 or 7 minutes, and it becomes increasingly excruciating. It became very, very quickly a damage limitation exercise, and quite often crisis comms are. But there was a lack of preparation for him beforehand. He didn't read the morning papers before he went on, and later on in the interview John Humphreys goes on to pick out something that was really important that was in the Guardian that morning. There was no rehearsal, I don't think, of difficult questions there, because he knew that he was facing the country's leading Rottweiler general who wasn't going to let him get him off the hook. Now, some people who listened to that felt that Humphreys bullied him. Some people felt that Entwistle could have put a lot sterner defence. Interestingly, by the Monday, he'd resigned as Director General. He was on defensive for most of the time, and he was unconvincing when on the attack. The messaging was okay, but the delivery poor. That's the general thought. Again, I'd be really interested to hear what you think. So what can you do? Well, you can expect the unexpected, the unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld called them a couple of years ago. What is your nightmare question number one? What is the question you don't want to answer? When you're asked that question, what are you going to say? You need to rehearse that. What is your nightmare question number two? Ditto. And if there's a nightmare question number three, you shouldn't be doing the interview in the first place, probably. So you need to get your top team around you with a wide variety of views and expertise. Act decisively and as quickly as you can in the golden hour. Competence is the issue, not sound bites. It's the other way round for politicians. Competence is the issue. Don't follow them. Don't follow leaders. They address different audiences. Be honest about what you do know and you don't know, and look smart. Use simple language. Avoid jargon. Avoid technical detail. Too much technical detail. It's the mainstream media. It's different if it's for the trade press. Use stats, but remember, less is more. One killer stat is better than 3 or 4. Public service broadcasters, as a Reuters report showed recently, are still mainly trusted throughout Europe, as opposed to the independent ones. You still obviously need to speak to the independent and commercial broadcasters, but public service broadcasters are still generally trusted to a greater or lesser degree on the country that you're from. Most people tend to absorb the news in bite-sized chunks online and after the event. It's worth bearing that in mind as well. Do not be afraid of repetition, and know the audience that you're hoping to speak to, whether it's a live audience or news. Rule of 3. It's not really a rule, I suppose, but I always say to our clients in our media training workshops that we do, the rule of 3: pity, praise, and promise. It shows many times if a company or organization, I remember a train crash a couple of years ago, a Virgin train crash. Richard Branson came on the TV. The first thing he does, he pity. He shows pity to the people who are injured or their families. He praises the emergency services, and he promises that they'll get to the bottom of the investigation. They'll get to the bottom of the accident, what caused the tragedy. It's an important thing to remember. The important information: police, fire, and ambulances. People first, property, then money. Don't say it's terrible, our building's been burnt down, it cost £35 million to make. Oh yes, and we're really sorry for the people that were killed in it. It doesn't work that way around, obviously. Don't speculate either about the cause of the crisis. That is part of the investigation. And as I keep saying, don't be afraid to repeat these messages. You'll feel more confident the more preparation you do. You'll better represent your organisation if you're under the spotlight, and hone your key messages. Hone the rule of three. If they need to change them. That's okay. Situations develop. The aggressive interviewer, the John Humphreys sound alike maybe. You can't lose your cool if they do. Keep your calm, remain focused, firm but accountable, maintain eye contact even on the radio, but particularly on TV, and don't get drawn into blind alleys if you're unsure where the interviewer is going, and display the key evidence to back up your case. Just after, if you've got time, anytime, look up TRAFIGURA. This will be something that you'll know about. The Probo Koala was that ship. It was commissioned by a Singaporean-based oil company, oil and commodities company called TRAFIGURA. And they had a load of toxic waste they needed to dump. It's quite a long, complicated story, but they weren't able to dump it in Europe. So they commissioned a company to dump it in the Ivory Coast. And lots of people were injured as a result of these dumps, 12 dumps around a port in the Ivory Coast. And they were big scandal a couple of years ago. I think it was about 2009. Big scandal. The company had to lay out a lot of money about it. There were claims that between 7 and 20 people died. There are 100,000 people in the country complaining of burns because of this toxic waste that had been dumped. And one of the key managers for the company was again asked to come into Newsnight. It was 2007. This is Eric de Turckheim had to come into Newsnight on BBC Two to defend his company's actions because it was alleged that they tried to cover it up.
And Eric de Turckheim of TRAFIGURA is with us now. Why did you send this waste to Africa?
Good evening. First of all, we very much regret the sickness of the people of Abidjan. However, TRAFIGURA is in no way responsible for such sickness, but we are supporting Ivory Coast efforts to clean up its environment and while at the same time defending ourselves against completely unfounded compensation claim. Let me take you briefly through
Can I repeat my question? Why did you send this waste to Africa?
Just listen to me briefly. I would like to take you through the facts and then I will answer the question. First of all, the waste in question, the slops, were a mixture of water, gasoline and caustic soda. Secondly, the discharge of slops is a routine operation which is carried out worldwide, and Abidjan is a sophisticated port fully equipped to handle such waste.
Right.
Three, the population of Abidjan has been suffering for a very long-term polluted environment.
Mr. Turckheim, can you just tell us, please, why you decided to send this waste to the Ivory Coast?
The vessel, as I said, was on the normal commercial voyage, and the slops it was carrying were absolutely not dangerous.
Mr. Turckheim, I think I'm making myself quite clear. Why did you choose to send it to the Ivory Coast?
We did not send the vessel to Ivory Coast. The vessel was on a normal commercial voyage.
But it was carrying a cargo that the Dutch had already told you it would cost €500,000 to make safe.
We faced in Holland an unexplained price hike of 3,000%. We left the country with a full blessing of the Dutch authority. The vessel carried then its normal commercial voyage.
And so on. The rest of the interview went on like that, in trying to avoid the trying to avoid the questions and did not come out of it as well as he could have done. Again, preparation being the key there. So remember that you're an ambassador for your country. You need to remember that all the time. And protecting the integrity of yourself and your brand is obviously paramount. It takes many years to build a brand and a few seconds to destroy it. When does a bad problem then become a crisis? Well, this guy is not the most popular man in the UK at the moment, related to the coronavirus and the money he's claimed. He wants the government to bail out Virgin. But he's been in a lot of scrapes in his time, and generally speaking, I think he's one of the best media performers around, regardless of what people think of him at the moment. Virgin lost the West Coast franchise a couple of years ago. They weren't successful. They eventually were, but they weren't at this time. And he was interviewed by Jeff Randall on Sky. I'm only going to play 2 minutes of this because I know we're against the clock here. But this is someone who I think knows how to handle the media in an authentic way.
Now, when Virgin Rail lost its bid for the West Coast Rail franchise to rival First Group, the response from Sir Richard Branson was immediate and unequivocal. He described the government's decision as, quote, insanity, and has since launched a legal challenge to overturn the result. This afternoon, Sir Richard appeared in front of the Transport Select Committee and was no less forthright.
This particular bid by First Group is absolutely preposterous when you examine it. I mean, it's just taking the system for a ride, literally.
Well, joining me now from our central London studio is Sir Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Group. Evening, Sir Richard. Many thanks for joining us.
Nice to do.
Now, you said in front of those MPs today, quote, this decision to go with First Group was bad for the country and bad for passengers. I suspect what you really meant was it was bad for Virgin and bad for its shareholders.
I could have added that too. We've been through this. This is the fourth time we've been through this. On the East Coast Main Line, we were runners-up twice to National Express and to GNER. They both went bust, and the East Coast Main Line is now languishing with 10 million less passengers than the West Coast Main Line. We also went through the same situation with Cross Country, where we were outbid and the company's losing a lot of money. So, what we believe is that the same thing will happen on the West Coast Main Line. We've spent 15 years building the West Coast Main Line into one of the best rail networks in the world, with a fantastic staff, with fantastic new trains, with much more, with three trips a day to the major cities instead of one an hour. Sorry, 3 trips an hour rather than 1 an hour, and we just don't want to see all that wasted. So we're fighting our corner.
Sir Richard, had you been successful and had you won this franchise, how much profit would Virgin have made over the life of the contract?
He doesn't answer that question. You won't be surprised though, he doesn't go into figures, but he dealt with a very aggressive interviewer throughout that, and he kept calm. He stumbled, but he was authentic. It doesn't matter about the accent, as I said before. It doesn't matter about the stumbling. He kept calm, and he came out of it really well. It's worth looking up. So keep your messages simple and concise. 3 key points you need to deliver across the slide. Branson was. From a 50-minute pre-recorded interview, and of course that one was live, but from a pre-recorded interview, expect 1 or 2 15-second clips. And one way to do it, if you haven't been interviewed before on the media, is visualize a member of the audience, your next door neighbor, your auntie or whatever. No jargon, abbreviations or technical details, maybe 1 or 2 killer stats. On camera, men, remember, expect to be on camera. Everyone has a phone nowadays, so a lot of it can end up on camera, not from technical camera people who work for the mainstream media as well. So beware of checked or stripy shirts. They can reproduce badly on screen. Avoid tight patterns. Bold, bright colours are good, those that warm up your skin tone. Check your tie and hair before you go on air. Women, avoid applying makeup that has a shine to it. Matte foundation is possible. Too much jewellery is a distraction, and wear appropriate attire, looking good without distracting from the message. Be nervous, but don't let it show if possible. Maintain eye contact with the interviewer and avoid looking down the lens or monitor that might be right next to the camera. You've probably seen this from a remote location where people are being interviewed and then they look to the right or they look at themselves in the monitor. It looks like you're shifty. You maintain eye contact with the camera, even though because it's a remote location, you probably won't be able to see the presenter, but you will be able to hear them in your earphone. But of course, when you're at home, the viewing public just sees you looking at the camera. They don't want to see you looking like that because you look shifty. If you want someone that tends to ramble under pressure, don't be afraid to pause, pace yourself, take a deep breath. Don't be tempted to look away for approval at the end of the interview either. Maintain contact with the camera, because if you look away for a relief or approval, again, it looks like you've got away with something and you don't want that. And as I said before, on radio, a short period of silence can improve your performance. Avoid phrases if possible which indicate doubt, such as we believe, we hope, we think. We're confident, we're convinced, we're optimistic is much better. And afterwards, you need to be treated fairly and with respect. So who will be doing the interview? What program is it for? Is it live or pre-rec? Will there be a discussion or a debate involving you? Will anyone else be commenting on your interview? If you feel you've been treated badly after an interview, you ring up afterwards and ask to speak to the editor, not the producer or the reporter that interviewed you. You go straight to the editor. Remain as positive and as confident and as focused as possible. Try to forget if you're in a studio that you're in a room full of total strangers and stay on message. Be positive and confident. Remember, you will know more about the subject than the interviewee.
Hi, Nick. Can I just draw your attention to the time? If you keep going for another couple of minutes and then we've got a few questions.
Yeah, well, I'm ready to take the questions now, Alison.
Oh, it is, in fact. Yes. What perfect timing you have, Mick. Great, thank you. Okay, let's have a look. So starting with something on disclosure. So if there's a legal case ongoing, can you remind us, please, what people can say to the media?
Well, very, very little. If there's a legal case going, you have to say, we've launched an investigation. I can't comment on any of those allegations. Having spoken to the lawyers, they will be able to tell you what you can and can't say. We are clearly taking the matter very seriously. We've launched an investigation. We've launched our own internal investigation, but the whole matter is now part of a legal case, and we unfortunately won't be able to comment on that at the moment, but rest assured we will in the future.
What happens when the media are digging around for some information? So they ask different people within your organization, so not necessarily the spokesperson.
Well, this is going to happen all the time, and this is why I said before, you need to make sure that all people within your organization are across what the rules and regulations are. You can't have people speaking out of time. Now, there are people that will do that off the record, but then if they're not willing to go on the record, the credibility of their particular claim is immediately diminished. So clearly, when you've got your senior leadership team or your board together, as long as the communications are there, then the communications person can speak to the lawyer, and quite often they'll have a row over what can and can't be said, but that's okay. That's within the office. If you've got the discipline among your team, and as I said, among your front of house staff as well, it's not just the senior people, then you can restrict that. You can't, as the spokesman for the company, comment on something that's part of an ongoing legal case. And unfortunately, there's no way around that. But there will be areas where there'll be push and pull. And as the communications director, he or she will be pulling in that direction. Look, we can't just go in front of the TV and say nothing. What can we say? And there's usually stuff you can say. And I think if, because of the nature of the case, there are too many legal pitfalls to jump into, then you really just have to say what I said originally. We're launching our own internal investigation. All allegations will be looked into, but the matter's with the courts at the moment. There's no problem. There's no point in you asking me any other questions. You're across the case. You're being authoritative, and you are giving them information. Okay, you're not giving them what they want, but in some of those areas, you just won't be able to do that.
Okay. So once you've said the wrong thing, how do you dig yourself out of that hole?
In the same interview or later?
Both.
Yeah, well, in the same interview. If it's a live interview, then you can just say, if you realise during the live interview, by the way, I made a mistake a minute ago, I'm a bit nervous for being on the telly, and then you can say to them, that's okay. That's okay. That if one of your spokespeople or you was to say something incorrectly and then realize when it comes out on the news last night, then you'd have to issue a statement and you'd have to get straight in contact with them. But you would need to speak to your lawyers first about that, depending on the nature of what you actually said. But I mean, that doesn't happen that often, but it does happen sometimes where someone will say something that's incorrect. Now, how important is that thing that you said was incorrect? If it's a minor detail, leave it. Or contact the newsroom, tell them it was a minor detail, correct it, but say, we don't have to go on about it. It was just a slip of the tongue. If it was important, then you'd have a little bit of a battle with the TV or radio company to see if they would let you come on afterwards and clarify that. But in the nature of a crisis, you probably will call it up again, and so you can actually address it then. Of course, if it's recorded, they may not use that bit. But generally, providing you've got a decent relationship with them, remember, as I said, you're not a politician, so you're not used to being on the TV all the time and doing that. With a fair wind, they should give you a fair chance to redress any errors that you made.
Yeah. Okay. So I noticed that you talked about initiating communications with the media. When do you think that's a good idea? So you've had something within your organisation that, well, generally you're not proud of, and you prefer it didn't come out in the media. Where is that balance between being proactive and sort of taking the initiative and you coming forward with your side of the story versus hoping that it's going to blow over and no one will bring it up? How do you approach that?
Every case is different, isn't it, Alison? I think I saw an interview with Tony Blair about 3 weeks ago talking about coronavirus, but he was referring to, I think he was referring to a crisis he'd been involved in, one of the many when he was PM. And he said one of the most important things he found was get as many, in inverted commas, experts from your company and maybe from outside around the table when you're discussing a particular incident. I think if you try to do everything yourself, as either a 1 or 2 man band, it's not ideal. If you get the views around and then you can talk it through, I can't sit here and say, well, this is what I would do in an unnamed situation. If you've got a decent relationship with members of the mainstream or the trade media anyway, you have to think from your own company's reputation, what will we gain by telling them this? And is there anything else around it? Things seldom happen in a bubble or a vacuum, do they? There's usually lots of related incidents and stuff. But I would say get a variety of opinion around the room, and you want people to talk about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns and all that stuff. You want people to come with stuff that basically you're going to ignore at the end of it. I mean, what Blair said, he said that when I forget which crisis it was he was involved in. I think it might have been the lorry drivers' crisis in Britain. The lorry drivers' crisis in Britain, where they all went on strike. And I think he said something like 97% of the ideas that people came up with were rubbish, or we were already doing. But 2 or 3%, they were the golden. That was good. That was good. That. Mm-hmm. And he said you only get that from a diversity of opinion among people you trust. And I think that's pretty important in a situation like the one that you've referred to.
Yeah, that's great advice. Okay, thank you. We've come to the end of our hour. So thank you very much, Mick, for talking to us, giving us some insight into this important topic at the moment. Yes, thank you everyone for joining us.
And if anyone has any other questions, Alison, because I know I did go on a little bit too long, longer than originally planned, I can take any emails or anything like that.
That's great. We can give out your email address. Is that okay?
Yes, it's mick@mickord.com.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks everyone, and goodbye.